grandfather clock in the sunless dining room of the Sterling Estate had a heavy metallic tick. It was the kind of sound that did not merely mark time, it enforced it, driving itself into the silence like a nail. Beatrice Sterling, Duchess of Sterling, in name alone, sat at the far end of the long mahogany table and listened to the nails being driven. There were 3 people at the table, though the table had been built to seat 24. Between them lay an expanse of polished wood, heavy silver candelabras, and an atmosphere so dense with unspoken contempt it could have suffocated a weaker woman. Beatrice was not a weaker woman. She was merely a woman who had spent 5 years learning that survival in this house required the stillness of a stone. She wore a pale grey silk gown. It had once been beautiful, perhaps 4 seasons ago, but repeated washing, and the strict, unyielding budget enforced by her mother-in-law had left the fabric weary. Near the right, Emma's small jagged tear had been carefully mended, though the stitches were still visible if one looked closely. Lady Clara Sterling, the Dowager Duchess, always looked closely. "It is a pity," Lady Clara said, her voice slicing through the heavy ticking of the clock. It was a voice perfectly calibrated for drawing-room cruelty, smooth-powdered and venomous. "That, even after 5 years, you have not learned how to manage a hem, Beatrice. But I suppose one cannot expect aristocratic habits from a girl who was effectively brought to us as a charity case." Beatrice did not flinch. She kept her posture rigid, her icy blue eyes fixed on the silver salt cellar, positioned exactly midway between her plate and Arthur's.
Your Grace.
She did not look at Lady Clara.
Listen to me.
Looking at Lady Clara meant
proves
looking at the woman's
everything.
hands, and looking at those
I
hands
wouldn't have
meant
come
looking at the
here if
ring.
it wasn't
It was a massive
urgent.
square-cut emerald set in heavy antique gold. You caught the dim light of the dining room and threw it back in arrogant green flashes. It was the Sterling family emerald, or so Lady Clara told everyone in London. It was not. It was the Alden emerald. It had belonged to Beatrice's mother. It had been on Beatrice's finger the day her father died, right up until the afternoon Lady Clara had informed the newly orphaned 16-year-old that a minor could not be trusted with family heirlooms. Beatrice slipped her right hand into the pocket of her faded grey gown. Her long pale fingers brushed against a small velvet-covered square, an empty ring box. She carried it every day. She carried it not out of sentimentality, but as a discipline. It was the physical anchor of her memory, a reminder of exactly what had been stolen and exactly who had stolen it. Arthur. Lady Clara continued turning her sharp powdered face toward her son. "The Earl of Merryweather is bringing his daughter to the annual gala next week, Lady Evelyn. A splendid girl. She wore the most magnificent velvet in Hyde Park yesterday. It is exhausting trying to maintain the dignity of the Sterling name when the current Duchess insists on walking through our halls looking like a dismissed governess." Beatrice shifted her gaze just a fraction, landing on her husband. Arthur Sterling, the 34-year-old Duke, sat parallel to his mother. He was dressed impeccably in a navy blue velvet smoking jacket, his light brown hair styled to careless perfection. He had the long aristocratic face of a man bred for oil paintings, but his pale green eyes were the eyes of a coward. At his mother's remark, Arthur did not defend his wife. He did not ask his mother to moderate her tone. He did what he had done for 5 years. He picked up his heavy crystal whiskey glass swirling the amber liquid inside, and looked resolutely out the dark window. I'm sure Beatrice does the best she can with the allowance she is given, mother. Arthur murmured, his voice lacking any real weight. It was the defense of a man throwing a single raindrop at a forest fire to say he had tried. Her allowance is exactly what is appropriate for a woman who brought nothing to this estate but a ruined father and a mountain of social pity. Clara snapped.
It's all right.
She raised her wine glass, the emerald flashing violently.
Time to
She should
open
be
your
grateful there's a
eyes.
roof over her head. Had we not taken her in, she would be sweeping streets. Under the table inside her pocket, Beatrice's thumb pressed hard into the sharp corner of the empty ring box. She did not bring a ruined father. Her father, Lord Alden, had been one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. He had possessed the Sterling Estate itself, having bought the mortgages when the previous Duke, Arthur's father, had driven the family into near bankruptcy. The arrangement had been simple. Beatrice's father would forgive the debts, and Beatrice would marry Arthur, elevating her family's merchant-tainted blood into high aristocracy. But Lord Alden had died suddenly of a fever 3 months before the wedding. He had died, leaving a minor daughter and a vast fortune. And within 2 weeks, Lady Clara had produced a legally binding document purportedly signed by Lord Alden on his deathbed, transferring the entirety of his assets, the estate, and Beatrice's guardianship to the Sterling family. Beatrice had been too young, too paralyzed by grief to understand how quickly she was being erased. By the time she was forced down the aisle to marry Arthur, she was no longer an heiress securing a title. She was an impoverished orphan being given a charitable home. They had taken her money, her house, her ring, and her voice. "You are awfully quiet tonight, Beatrice." Clara noted her black beady eyes narrowing. "Have you finally realized the sheer inadequacy of your presence here?" Beatrice looked up. She looked past the salt cellar, past the flickering candles, and met her mother-in-law's gaze directly. Beatrice's eyes were a startling icy blue, and unlike Arthur's, they did not waver. She did not blink. She held the older woman's stare with a cold, devastating calm that always unsettled the Dowager Duchess, though Clara would never admit it. "I am listening, Lady Clara," Beatrice said. Her voice was low, smooth, and entirely devoid of the trembling submission Clara demanded. "I find that when one listens long enough, people eventually say exactly what they mean." Clara's thin lips pressed into a harsh line. "Insolent girl. Arthur, tell your wife to lower her eyes when she speaks to me." Arthur took a deep swallow of his whiskey. "Beatrice, please. Let us just have a peaceful dinner." "I am perfectly peaceful, Arthur," Beatrice replied softly. She was. For the first time in 5 years, Beatrice felt a profound chilling peace settling over her bones. The fear was gone. The desperate suffocating hope that Arthur might one day wake up and be a man was gone. The agonizing wait for justice was over, because Beatrice had finally realized that justice would not be handed to her. She had to take it. Upstairs in her cold, unlit bedroom in the East Wing, sitting on a small wooden writing desk was a document. It was 3 pages long, written in the meticulous handwriting of Mr. Vance, a solicitor in London. It was a petition for the annulment of her marriage based on grounds she had carefully gathered over 36 months. But the annulment was not her final weapon. It was merely the match. "I have instructed the servants not to serve you dessert," Clara announced abruptly, setting down her fork. "You have not earned it! You will return to your room, Beatrice, and you will not attend the gala next week. I will not have Lady Evelyn see my son burdened by a ghost in a ragged dress." Arthur looked down at his plate. He did not object. He allowed his wife to be banished from a dining room in the very house her father had paid for. Beatrice stood up. The movement was so graceful, so entirely devoid of the humiliation Clara intended, that it left a strange, heavy silence in its wake. She smoothed the skirt of her pale grey gown, her hand grazing the mended tear at the hem. "As you wish," Beatrice said. She did not curtsy. She did not bow her head. She looked at the emerald on Clara's finger one last time, her expression completely unreadable. "Enjoy the house tonight, Lady Clara. Enjoy the whiskey, Arthur." Arthur frowned, confused by the odd phrasing, but before he could speak, Beatrice turned and walked toward the grand double doors. Her posture was rigid, her spine a line of pure steel. Her footsteps on the hardwood floor were light, but they echoed with the terrifying precision of a woman who knew exactly how many steps were left until the end. She left the dining room, walking into the shadowed, marble-floored hallway. The grandfather clock chimed the half hour. Tomorrow morning, she would hand Arthur the annulment, and by the night of the gala, she would take back her world. The air in the upper corridors of the Sterling estate grew colder the higher one climbed. By the time Beatrice reached the 3rd floor, the thick Persian carpets of the grand halls had given way to bare, unpolished oak. By the time she reached the narrow, winding servant stairs that led to the attic, the opulent warmth of the house had vanished entirely, replaced by the damp metallic chill of a forgotten space. She walked in near darkness, carrying a single unshielded candle. The faint flickering light cast long trembling shadows against the plaster walls, but Beatrice's hand was perfectly steady. Her pale grey silk gown whispered against the rough wooden steps. The mended tear at her hem caught briefly on a splinter, but she pulled it free with a practiced silent motion. She had learned how to move through this house without making a sound. Ghosts, after all, were not supposed to be heard. She reached the top of the stairs and pushed open the heavy oak door of the attic. It groaned in protest, revealing a massive cavernous room filled with the discarded history of the Sterling family. Broken chairs, trunks of moth-eaten velvet, cracked oil paintings, shrouded in canvas, a graveyard of aristocratic excess. The air smelled of dry rot, old dust, and the sharp scent of camphor. Beatrice did not look at the Sterling heirlooms. She walked a precise path through the clutter, counting her steps, 12 paces from the door. Turned left at the grand piano with the missing legs. 7 paces toward the small circular window that looked out over the sprawling moonlit grounds. She knelt on the floorboards. The wood was freezing against her knees. She set the candle down, slipping her right hand into the pocket of her gown. Her fingertips traced the velvet edge of the empty ring box, once drawing the cold memory into her chest before she reached out and pressed her palms against a seemingly unremarkable floorboard. With a firm push, the board shifted. It was loose. She prodded up, exposing a dark, narrow cavity between the joists. Inside the hollow space lay a rectangular package wrapped in dark, oiled cloth. Beatrice lifted it out. It was heavy. Heavier than paper had any right to be. As she untied the coarse twine binding the cloth, her breathing slowed, matching the deliberate, icy rhythm of a woman who had spent 5 years learning to control her heart rate. She peeled back the oilcloth, revealing a thick stack of high-grade vellum parchment. And there, resting on the top page, was the seal. It was a thick, heavy impression of deep red wax. Pressed into the center of the wax was the Alden family crest, a hawk in flight, clutching a broken arrow. It was her father's seal. It was her father's truth. For a moment, kneeling in the dust, Beatrice was not 29. She was 16, again, standing in the suffocating heat of a sick room, watching the life leave the only man who had ever truly loved her. The memory did not come with tears. It came with a visceral, physical sensation of her throat closing and her fingers going numb. She remembered the smell of the fever sweat. She remembered the terrifying stillness of her father's chest, but most vividly, she remembered the sound of the bedroom door opening, before her father's body had even fully cooled. Lady Clara had walked in, flanked by 2 lawyers Beatrice had never seen before. Clara had not offered a word of comfort. She had simply stepped up to the weeping, paralyzed 16-year-old girl, taken Beatrice's right hand, and ruthlessly twisted the heavy emerald ring off her finger. "Minors cannot hold such weight, my dear," Clara had said, her voice dripping with a sickly false pity. "You are our ward now. The Sterling family will manage your burdens." Beatrice remembered looking past Clara's shoulder, desperately seeking salvation. Arthur had been standing in the hallway. He was 21 then, already carrying the title of Duke. He was supposed to be her fiancé. He was supposed to be a gentleman. But when Beatrice had caught his eye, begging him silently to stop his mother, Arthur had simply lowered his gaze and stepped back into the shadows, letting the door close. In that single cowardly retreat, Arthur had sealed his fate. He had let his mother forge a deathbed will. He had let his mother claim the Alden fortune to pay off the Sterling debts. He had let them erase Beatrice's identity, turning a wealthy heiress into an impoverished charity case forced into a marriage out of pity. Beatrice ran her thumb over the cold red wax of the true will. Her father had known. In his final lucid days, Lord Alden had realized the depth of Clara Sterling's greed. He had drawn up this master will in secret, locking the estate and the fortune into a trust that only Beatrice could claim upon reaching her majority or dissolving her marriage. He had hidden this copy in the attic of the very house he had purchased, knowing Clara would never dirty her hands, searching the dust. Beatrice had found it 6 months ago, purely by accident, when a leak in the roof had forced her to inspect the attic because Clara had dismissed half the household staff to save money. She unfolded the thick parchment, holding it near the candle flame. The ink was still dark, the handwriting sharp and undeniable. I, Richard Alden, being of sound mind, do hereby revoke all previous testaments. I leave the entirety of my worldly assets, including the deeds to the Sterling estate, solely and exclusively to my daughter, Beatrice Alden. The Sterling family shall have no claim, no right of management, and no residence upon these lands, save by her express permission. Permission. Beatrice looked out the circular window at the sprawling moonlit lawns of the estate. Clara had banished her from the dining room tonight. Clara had forbidden her from attending the annual gala next week. Clara paraded around London wearing stolen jewels, complaining about the cost of Beatrice's faded dresses. while
Tell
living
me about
beneath
your
a roof
castle.
that
It
Beatrice
looks
technically owned.
very grand.
Beatrice carefully folded the will, wrapped it back in the oilcloth, and returned it to its hiding place beneath the floorboard. She did not need to take it downstairs yet. The trap was not fully set. She stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and picked up her candle. When Beatrice returned to her bedroom in the east wing, the fire in the grate had died entirely. The room was freezing. Clara allowed her only one scuttle of coal a day, and Beatrice had used it that morning. She did not mind the cold. She preferred it. Cold things did not break easily. She walked to the small wooden writing desk in the corner. She did not light the oil lamp. Oil too was rationed. She worked by the light of the single candle. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a sheet of plain, uncrested paper and a pen. She dipped the nibby into the inkwell and began to write. Her handwriting was elegant, sharp, and entirely devoid of hesitation. To Mr. Vance Lincoln's Inn, London. The final preparations are complete. The Dowager Duchess intends to host the annual Sterling Gala on the Friday, next the 14th of November. The entire county will be in attendance. It is the perfect stage. You are to arrive at the estate precisely at 11 o'clock in the evening. Bring the authenticated copies of the Alden, will the foreclosure notices, and the constables. We will not be negotiating, we will be executing the law. I remain sincerely Beatrice Alden. She did not sign it as the Duchess of Sterling. She signed it with a true name, the name they had tried to erase. She folded the letter, melted a drop of plain brown wax over the seam, and pressed it flat with her thumb. She would give it to the stable boy tomorrow at dawn. The boy was loyal to her. She had saved his position when Arthur had threatened to dismiss him over a lame horse last winter. With the letter sealed, Beatrice turned her attention to the other document resting on the desk. 3 pages of heavy legal paper tied with a black silk ribbon. The petition for an annulment. She reached out and rested her hand flat against the pages. This was her shield. This was the distraction. If she simply struck at them with the will, Arthur might try to stall in the courts, claiming his rights as her husband to manage her property. He would drag the legal battle out for years. But if she handed him an annulment first, if she claimed the marriage was invalid, unconsummated in spirit, and fractured beyond repair, Arthur's arrogant pride would blind him. He would see a broken, exhausted woman trying to run away. He and Clara would be so eager to discard her, so eager to officially clear the path for Lady Evelyn and her new dowry, that they would practically push her out the door. They would not look closely at the shadows gathering around them. They would not realize that by severing the marriage, they were severing their only legal defense to her father's will. They thought she was a fragile bird begging to be let out of the cage. They did not realize she owned the cage, the house it sat in, and the ground beneath it. Beatrice blew out the candle. The room plunged into absolute darkness, save for the pale moonlight spilling across the floorboards. She undressed in the dark, shivering as the cold air hit her skin. She climbed into the narrow, unheated bed, pulling the thin quilt up to her chin. Her hand slipped under the pillow, her fingers closing tightly around the empty velvet ring box. Tomorrow morning, the Duke of Stirling would receive his paperwork. He would laugh. His mother would mock her. Beatrice would stand in silence and let them, because pain, she had learned, was a highly effective currency, and she was about to spend all of hers to buy their ruin. She closed her eyes, her breathing steady, deep, and perfectly calm. She did not dream. Queens preparing for war rarely do. The morning light filtering through the tall windows. The Duke's study was thick and golden, catching the dust motes dancing above the Persian rug. The room smelled of expensive leather stale cigar smoke and the faint citrus scent of Arthur's cologne. It was a room designed to project authority, a fortress of mahogany and brass built, for a man who possessed none of his own. Arthur Stirling sat behind the massive desk, a silver letter opener in one hand, and a stack of unpaid bills in the other. He looked tired. Maintaining the illusion of vast wealth when the estate's coffers were slowly bleeding dry was an exhausting endeavor. He tossed a bill from a London tailor onto the polished wood with a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. He did not hear the door open. Beatrice had long ago mastered the art of walking without making a sound. It was only when a shadow fell across the ledger he was reading that Arthur looked up. He jumped, slightly startled. Beatrice was standing perfectly still on the opposite side of the desk. She was wearing the same pale grey silk gown from the night before, the small mended tear at the hem resting silently against the toe of her worn leather shoe. "Beatrice," Arthur said, recovering his composure and instantly shifting into a tone of mild irritation. You startled me? You know I do not like to be disturbed while I'm managing the estate's affairs. Beatrice did not look at the stack of bills. She looked directly into his pale green eyes. Her own eyes, icy and unblinking, seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. Without a word, she raised her hand and placed a document in the exact center of his desk. 3 sheets of heavy legal paper bound together by a single black silk ribbon. Arthur frowned. He set down his silver letter opener. He looked at the document, then at her, his aristocratic face arranging itself into an expression of patronizing patience. What is this? Another list of complaints about the rationing of the coal. I told you Mother handles the household expenses. Read it, Arthur, Beatrice said softly. Arthur let out a slow, deliberate breath, the universal sound of a husband indulging a tedious wife. He picked up the document. His eyes scanned the first line. Petition for declaration of nullity of marriage. For a moment, Arthur simply froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. His eyes darted down the page, catching phrases that seemed to strike him physically. Irreconcilable fracture. Unconsummated in spirit. Petitioner Beatrice Alden. Respondent Arthur Sterling, Duke of Stirling.
Guilty.
This is an annulment. Arthur breathed, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. He looked up, his hands actually trembling enough to make the heavy paper rustle. You are asking for an annulment. I'm not asking, Arthur. I'm informing you. The shock on his face lasted for exactly 3 seconds before his ego, a fragile and deeply guarded thing, rushed in to protect him. The panic vanished, replaced by a dark, ugly flush rising up his neck. He dropped the papers back onto the desk as if they had burned him. You have lost your mind? Arthur snapped, his voice climbing an octave. He stood up, leaning his palms flat against the mahogany.
Immediately.
Is this a joke? Is this your pathetic attempt to punish me for Mother sending you away from dinner last night? It is a legal document drafted by a solicitor in London, Beatrice replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. Inside her pocket, her thumb found the corner of the empty velvet ring box. She pressed into it, drawing strength from the sharp edge. It requires only your signature to take effect. Arthur let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. My signature? You expect me to sign a document dissolving our marriage? Do you have any idea what you're doing, Beatrice? If I sign this, you cease to be the Duchess of Stirling. You cease to have a home. You cease to have a name. I have a name, Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a register of cold iron. My name is Beatrice Alden. Alden is a dead name, Arthur shouted, finally losing his temper. Your father died penniless. We took you in. I gave you my title to save you from ruin. If you walk out of this house, you walk out with nothing. You will have no allowance, no carriage, no servants. You will be on the streets of London, begging for a governor's position by the end of the month. Beatrice watched him. She watched the vein throbbing at his temple, the desperate anger of a weak man trying to assert dominance through volume. He truly believed it. He truly believed that her father's wealth belonged to him, that the forgery his mother had committed 5 years ago was an impenetrable shield. Before Beatrice could answer, the double doors of the study swung open with a dramatic clatter. Lady Clara Sterling swept into the room, her heavy, purple day dress rustling aggressively. She stopped just inside the doorway, her black eyes darting between her flushed son and her eerily calm daughter-in-law. The massive emerald ring on her right hand flashed in the morning sun. I can hear you shouting from the corridor, Arthur, Clara said sharply. What on earth is the matter? Has the girl finally done something to warrant a dismissal to the country house? Arthur gestured wildly to the desk. Look at this mother. Look at what she has brought me. Clara glided forward. She did not ask Beatrice for permission. She picked up the papers tied with the black ribbon, adjusted her reading glasses, and scanned the text. Unlike Arthur, Clara did not go pale. Clara did not panic. As the Dowager Duchess read the words, a slow, terrifying smile spread across her powdered face. It was the smile of a predator realizing the prey had just willingly walked into a snare. An annulment, Clara murmured, tasting the word, as if it were a rare vintage of wine. She looked up at Beatrice, her beady eyes glittering with malicious delight. Well, it seems 5 years of living among your betters has finally taught you your proper place. You have realized you are entirely unfit for the title. Mother, Arthur hissed, stepping around the desk. We cannot have a scandal. The gala is on Friday. Oh, hush, Arthur, you lack vision. Clara snapped, waving the document at him. This is not a scandal. This is a blessing. Do you not see if she divorces you, you are a free man? A duke still in his prime, unburdened by a barren, melancholic wife from a merchant family. Clara turned her predatory gaze back to Beatrice. And just yesterday we were discussing the Earl of Merryweather's daughter, Lady Evelyn, a girl with impeccable breeding, and more importantly, a dowry of 60,000 pounds. Arthur blinked the anger draining out of him as his mother's logic took hold. He looked at Beatrice, then at the papers, his mind slowly turning the gears. If Beatrice left, he wouldn't have to look at her anymore. He wouldn't have to feel the silent, crushing weight of his own guilt every time she entered a room. He could marry a wealthy, cheerful girl who did not look at him with icy blue eyes. You would sign away your title? Arthur asked Beatrice, his voice suddenly quiet, calculating. Just like that? You would leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. I will leave with exactly what belongs to me, Beatrice said. The double meaning hung in the air, invisible to the two aristocrats blinded by their own greed. Clara laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. What belongs to you, my dear, is the torn dress you are wearing, and perhaps a single suitcase of undergarments. Your father left you nothing. But if you wish to throw yourself into the gutter to spare us the sight of your miserable face, I will not stand in your way. Clara tossed the annulment papers back onto the desk. She tapped the top page with her finger, the Alden emerald clicking sharply against the mahogany. Sign it, Arthur, Clara ordered. Sign it today. We will file it with the courts tomorrow. By Friday, she will be entirely removed from this estate, and the gala can serve as a celebration of your renewed availability. I will not rush a legal matter simply because you wish to redecorate the dining room, Mother, Arthur said, trying to claw back some semblance of authority. He looked at Beatrice, puffing his chest out slightly. I will review these papers with my solicitor. I will give you my answer by Friday morning. If I decide to grant you this mercy, you will be gone before the first carriage arrives for the gala. Friday morning is acceptable, Beatrice said. Her voice was so calm, so utterly devoid of the weeping or pleading they expected from a ruined woman that it unsettled Arthur again. He squinted at her, trying to find the crack in her armor. He found nothing, only the cold, fathomless blue of her eyes. Why are you doing this now? Arthur asked the question, slipping out before he could stop himself. After 5 years, what changed? Beatrice looked at the black ribbon on the desk, then she looked at the emerald on Clara's finger. Finally she met Arthur's gaze. I simply realized, Arthur, Beatrice said slowly, her voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room, that I am tired of living in a house full of thieves. Clara gasped, her face flushing with sudden violent rage. How dare you speak to us? Friday morning, Arthur. Beatrice interrupted, cutting Clara off with the sharpness of a blade. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to. Her presence suddenly felt enormous, suffocating the space in the room. Have the ink ready. I will not ask twice. She did not wait for a dismissal. She turned on her heel and walked toward the door. You are making the biggest mistake of your life. Beatrice Lake, Arthur called out after her, his voice defensive and shrill. When you are freezing in a rented room in London, do not come crawling back to my gates. Beatrice paused in the open doorway. She did not turn around. She did not look back at the man who had traded her life for his comfort. Do not worry, Arthur, Beatrice said quietly to the heavy oak door frame. I assure you I will never beg at your gates. She stepped out into the corridor and pulled the doors shut behind her, cutting off the sound of Clara's poisonous muttering. As she walked down the hall, Beatrice slipped her hand back into her pocket. Her fingers brushed the empty ring box, but this time she did not press into the sharp corner. She simply let her hand rest there, relaxed. The match was struck. The fuse was lit. Let Lady Clara order the finest champagne. Let Arthur dream of a new wealthy bride. Let the entire county arrive in their best silks and velvet on Friday night. They were preparing for a gala. Beatrice Alden was preparing for an execution. The Sterling Annual Gala was by all accounts a masterpiece of financial fiction. To the untrained eye, the massive banquet hall on the ground floor of the estate was a testament to the enduring, untouchable wealth of the Sterling bloodline. 5 towering crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting brilliant warm light over 70 of the most influential aristocrats in the county. The air was thick with the scent of expensive French perfumes, roasted meats, and the sharp, bright tang of poured champagne. A 12-piece orchestra played a lively waltz in the corner, the music sweeping up into the gilded arches. But underneath the silk and the laughter, the estate was bleeding. The champagne had been purchased on credit. The musicians had been promised payment by the end of the quarter. And the Dowager Duchess Lady Clara was holding court near the grand fireplace, smiling a brittle, powdered smile as she aggressively steered the conversation toward her son's sudden, highly convenient bachelorhood. "Yes, it is a tragedy, of course," Clara was saying to the Countess of Harrington, her voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. She raised her wineglass, the massive Olden emerald flashing an arrogant green in the chandelier light. But Arthur has always been too kind. He tried to elevate the girl, he truly did. But one cannot force a merchant's daughter to understand the pressures of a dukedom. She simply crumbled under the weight of it. We granted her the annulment this morning as an act of profound mercy. Across the room, Arthur Sterling was leaning against a marble pillar, looking more relaxed than he had in 5 years. He wore a sharply tailored evening coat with silver thread embroidery, looking every inch the wealthy, eligible duke. Standing beside him was Lady Evelyn, the Earl of Merryweather's 19-year-old daughter. She was blushing, giggling behind a painted silk fan as Arthur charmed her with practiced ease. Arthur took a sip of his champagne, letting the cool liquid soothe his throat. He felt light. The suffocating tension that had plagued his shoulders for years was gone. That morning, in the privacy of his study, he had signed his name to the annulment papers. He had watched his solicitor apply the seal. He had been terrified for a fleeting moment of the social fallout, but his mother had been right. The narrative had been easily spun. Beatrice was framed as a fragile, unstable woman who could not handle the life of a duchess, and he was the noble, suffering husband who had finally set her free. He had expected Beatrice to weep when he received the signed copy. He had expected her to come to his door begging for a small allowance, or a carriage to take her to London. Instead, the servants had reported that Beatrice had simply taken the papers, packed a single leather satchel, and locked herself in the east wing. By noon, Arthur had ordered the guards at the main gates not to let her back in once she finally left. As far as he was concerned, she was a ghost who had finally been exorcised from his halls. The grandfather clock in the corridor chimed 11 times. In the ballroom, the orchestra finished a sweeping waltz and paused to turn their sheet music. For a few seconds, the room was filled only with the low, comfortable murmur of high society gossip and the clinking of crystal glasses. Then a sound cut through the murmurs. It was a sharp, rhythmic crack. It sounded like a silver-tipped walking stick striking the marble floor of the grand gallery just outside the ballroom doors. Crack, step, crack, step. The doors at the top of the sweeping, dual-curved staircase at the far end of the ballroom were closed. They were the doors that led to the private, upper wings of the estate. No one was supposed to enter from there. All the guests had arrived through the front portico. The murmuring in the room began to falter. Heads turned. The guests closest to the staircase took a subconscious step back, their instincts, catching the strange, heavy shift in the atmosphere before their conscious minds could process it. Arthur frowned, lowering his champagne glass. Lady Evelyn looked up at him, confused. "Your Grace, is there another guest arriving?" "No," Arthur said, a sudden, inexplicable knot pulling tight in his stomach.
You think you can escape
"No one else is
me?
expected." Crack.
Descends
The heavy
now.
oak doors at the top of the grand staircase
Your
swung open.
reckoning is
The two
here.
footmen standing on the
I
landing
will
scrambled
not be
backward, looking
defied.
utterly terrified. And there, standing framed in the doorway, looking down at the
You
glittering,
thought you
crowded
could
ballroom,
outmaneuver
was
me.
Beatrice. Arthur's breath caught in
Your
his throat.
moves
His
were
fingers
so
went numb, nearly dropping his
predictable,
glass.
Jim.
This was not the Beatrice he knew. This
You
was not the
would
broken,
through
faded
your
woman
mist
who had ghosted
of
through his
defiance.
hallways in mended grey silk. This was not the fragile
Please, you
charity
must
case who lowered her
understand.
eyes and took his mother's abuse in silence.
paper
She was
changes
dressed in a sharp,
everything for
immaculately
us.
tailored midnight blue riding habit.
Beg you,
The
don't
fabric was rich
hurt
and
her.
heavy, cut to enhance the rigid, imperious line of
me,
her spine.
please.
The high collar was stark white, pressing against her throat like armor. Her platinum blonde hair, usually pulled back in a simple, fading knot, was now tightly braided and woven like a crown across the top of her head. In her right hand, resting casually against her thigh, she held a long leather riding crop tipped with solid silver.
I know what you've
She
done.
looked down at the
Changes
room of
nothing.
70 aristocrats with eyes as
Your
cold and
betrayal
bottomless
was
as a frozen
expected.
lake.
It only strengthens
She did not
our-
look like a woman who had just been divorced
You
and
will
thrown
watch
out of her
everything
home.
crumble
She looked
round,
like a
and I
conqueror
will
inspecting
feel
a
nothing.
newly surrendered province. Total suffocating silence fell over the ballroom. The musicians froze with their bows hovering over their strings. Beatrice began to descend the stairs. She moved with a slow, predatory grace. The silver tip of her riding crop tapped against the marble edge of each step. Ticky, tick, tick. It was a precise, terrifying metronome that seemed to sync perfectly with the racing heartbeats of the people watching her. Whispers broke out across the floor like dry brush catching fire. Is that the Duchess? I thought she had left the estate. Good God, look at her eyes. Arthur felt the blood drain entirely from his face. He pushed away from the marble pillar, abandoning Lady Evelyn without a word. His mind was racing, tripping over its own panic. She was supposed to be gone. The papers were signed. What is she doing? Why is she dressed like that? Near the fireplace, Lady Clara's powdered face had turned an ugly mottled shade of crimson. Her beady eyes were wide with furious disbelief. She slammed her wineglass down onto a side table with enough force to shatter the stem, the olden emerald flashing violently on her hand. How dare she? Clara hissed, her voice vibrating with pure rage. She pushed her way through the crowd, her heavy purple dress sweeping the floor. How dare she show her face here? Beatrice reached the bottom of the grand staircase. The crowd parted for her instantly, instinctively stepping back to create a wide, empty circle around her. No one wanted to be close to the sheer, freezing pressure radiating from her. Clara marched into the center of the circle, flanked closely by Arthur, who was trying desperately to arrange his face into a mask of stern authority. What is the meaning of this? Clara demanded, her voice shrill, shattering the silence of the room. She pointed a trembling finger at Beatrice's chest. You are trespassing. You signed the petition for annulment. My son signed it this morning. You are no longer his wife. You are no longer a sterling. You have absolutely no right to be in this house, let alone disrupt a private gathering. Beatrice did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply stopped walking, resting both
Wake
hands
up,
on the
dear.
silver handle
We have to go
of her
now.
riding crop and looked at Clara.
What is
I'm well
it?
aware the papers were
It's
signed.
time.
Lady
We must
Clara.
leave.
Beatrice said.
But why?
Her voice was
Where
low,
are we
smooth, and
going?
carried effortlessly across the
Safety.
silent ballroom.
Stay close
It was a voice
to
that
me.
did not ask for attention. It demanded it. In fact, I insisted upon it. Arthur stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to reclaim the room. Then you know you have no business here, Beatrice. This is a pathetic display. Are you trying to embarrass me in front of my guests? Because you are only humiliating yourself. Leave this house immediately before I have the footman throw you out into the gravel. Beatrice shifted her icy blue gaze to Arthur. Arthur's throat clicked. Up close, without the faded grey dress, without the bowed head, he suddenly realized he did not recognize the woman standing in front of him. For 5 years he had convinced himself she was a mouse. He realized now with a sickening drop in his stomach that she had merely been a trap waiting to snap shut. You will not have anyone thrown out, Arthur, Beatrice said softly. She tilted
Your
her head,
Grace,
observing
the
him with
reports
the
are
detached
dire.
curiosity of someone
What
watching
is
a
this
beetle
nonsense?
struggle on its back.
Explain.
Because you no longer have the
You're
authority
ruined.
to give orders
The
to my staff.
estate is bankrupt.
The whisper that swept through the
The numbers
crowd
don't
was audible
lie.
this time.
Oh,
My
no,
staff.
no.
Clara let out a harsh barking laugh. Your staff? Have you truly gone mad? The grief of losing your title has broken your mind. You own nothing. Your father died a bankrupt fool, and we saved you from the gutter. You are a penniless spinster trespassing in the Duke of Stirling's home. Beatrice's eyes snapped back to Clara, locking onto the older woman, with a ferocity that made Clara take an involuntary half-step backward. My father, Beatrice said, every word dripping with cold, precise venom, was a man of exceptional foresight.
No,
He knew
this
exactly what kind of
can't
vultures
be
circled his
happening.
lands. He knew that if he
Entire
died,
world is
a certain
crumbling.
dowager duchess would not hesitate to forge a deathbed transfer of assets to save her own family's rotting debts. The ballroom erupted into gasps. Several guests covered their mouths. Clara's face went entirely white beneath her powder. Slander! Clara shrieked, looking wildly at the guests. She is mad. Arthur, call the guards. Have her arrested for slander. Arthur stepped toward Beatrice, his hands reaching out to grab her arm. Beatrice, that is enough! You are leaving now. Crack. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Beatrice had not moved her body, but her right hand had snapped the leather riding crop up the silver tip, striking Arthur's wrist with brutal, stinging precision just before he could touch her. Arthur yelled in pain, recoiling, clutching his wrist against his chest. He stared at her, utterly horrified. Beatrice lowered the crop slowly. She did not break eye contact with him. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "You do not have the right to touch me as a husband because you signed it away. And you do not have the right to touch me as a duke because the ground you are standing on does not belong to you." "Lies?" Clara screamed, completely losing her aristocratic composure. She looked like a cornered animal. "It is all lies. She has no proof of anything. Throw her out." Beatrice smiled. It was not a happy expression. It was a sharp, clinical, pulling back of the lips that held zero warmth.
And I'll make
She
them
looked
sorry.
past Clara, past Arthur, toward the grand entrance doors at the far end of the hall. The grandfather clock in the corridor finished its 11th chime. "I have not brought you lies,
Yes.
Lady Clara,"
It's our castle.
Beatrice said quietly, the silence in the room so profound that every person heard her. "I have brought you the law."
I promise.
On cue, the heavy double doors of the main entrance swung open. The cold November wind rushed into the ballroom, making the chandelier crystals chime against one another. Standing in the doorway, framed by the dark, rain-swept night, was an elderly gentleman in a stark black coat carrying a thick leather briefcase. Behind him stood two uniformed constables of the crown. Mr. Vance, the solicitor, stepped into the ballroom. He adjusted his spectacles, looked at the crowd, and then bowed deeply, not to Arthur, not to Clara, but to the woman in midnight blue. "Good evening, Your Grace." The solicitor said, his voice ringing out clearly. "I have brought the authenticated documents just as you instructed." Arthur felt his knees go weak. The ballroom began to spin. Beatrice did not look at her ex-husband. She kept her eyes locked on Clara, who was now staring at the solicitor, as if looking at the devil himself. "Shall we proceed to the reading?" Beatrice asked, her icy eyes glinting in the chandelier light. "I believe the Duke and Dowager are finally ready to understand whose house they have been squatting in." The silence in the ballroom was no longer merely the absence of noise. It had become a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the 70 aristocrats gathered under the crystal chandeliers. They were people who spent their lives observing the subtle shifts of power, a snubbed bow, a misdirected invitation, a slight change in seating arrangements. But this was no subtle shift. This was a public execution. Mr. Vance, the elderly solicitor, walked slowly across the polished marble floor. His shoes made a soft, deliberate scuffing sound.
I must confess.
Behind him, the two constables of the crown marched in perfect, imposing step, their hands resting on the hilts of their truncheons. Crow parted for them, parting like water before the prow of a warship. Arthur Sterling's chest heaved. He clutched his stinging right wrist where Beatrice's riding crop had struck him, and stared at the approaching solicitor with wild, panicked eyes. He knew Mr. Vance. Vance had handled the Sterling Estate's dwindling accounts for years. Vance! Arthur shouted, his voice cracking, desperate to reassert his authority in front of the watching earls and countesses. "What is the meaning of this?" "You are my solicitor. I demand you order these constables to remove this woman immediately. She is trespassing on Sterling land." Mr. Vance reached the center of the room. He did not bow to Arthur. He stopped beside Beatrice, turning his body slightly to stand shoulder to shoulder with her in the midnight blue riding habit. "I was the Sterling family's solicitor for a time, Your Grace," Mr. Vance said smoothly, adjusting his spectacles. "But before that, I was the executor of the late Lord Richard Alden's estate, and it is in that capacity that I'm here tonight." Clara Sterling let out a sound that was half gasp, half snarl. "Lord Alden is dead. He left everything to us. The matter was settled 5 years ago by the High Courts. The matter was obscured 5 years ago. Lady Clara." Mr. Vance corrected his voice, carrying the dry, unyielding authority of the law. "Obscured by a document that we have now definitively proven to be a forgery." The word dropped into the ballroom like a lit match into dry hay. Forgery. The aristocrats gasped. The Earl of Merryweather, who had been pushing his daughter, Lady Evelyn, toward Arthur all evening, suddenly reached out and yanked the terrified 19-year-old girl firmly behind his back, putting physical distance between his family and the Duke of Sterling. Clara's face contorted into a mask of pure ugly desperation.
And the look on
You
her
lying old
face.
fool. I have the deathbed,
all
will I have the
just
signature?
adore me.
You have a clumsy imitation of a signature orchestrated by a desperate woman whose late husband had gambled away the sterling fortune, Beatrice said. Her voice was like crushed ice. She did not yell. She simply let the truth slice through the room. My father was dying, Clara, but his mind was perfectly sharp. He knew exactly what you were. He knew you were waiting to pick his bones clean. Beatrice held out her left hand. Mr. Vance opened his heavy leather briefcase. He did not pull out a standard legal folio. He pulled out a dark, oiled cloth package. With deliberate care, he untied the twine and folded back the cloth. Resting in the solicitor's hands was a thick stack of high-grade vellum, and stamped upon the very top page, gleaming fiercely in the chandelier light, was a massive unbroken seal of deep red wax. It bore the unmistakable crest of the Alden family, a hawk in flight, clutching a broken arrow. This, Mr. Vance announced to the breathless room, is the true final testament of Lord Richard Alden, written, signed, and witnessed 1 week prior to his passing. I have the sworn affidavits of the 2 witnesses, a physician and a magistrate, who have authenticated this seal and this signature before the Court of Chancery this very afternoon. Arthur stared at the red wax seal. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. No,
You think this
he whispered,
gathering
shaking his
hides
head.
your schemes?
No, that is impossible. I
Yours
shall
to
read the
trust.
primary clause.
The
Mr.
truth
Vance continued
will
unfolding the
crush
heavy parchment.
our
He cleared his
escape
throat.
by Esmental
I,
everything.
Richard Alden, being of sound mind, do
You
hereby
cannot
revoke
hide.
all previous testaments. I leave the entirety of my worldly assets, including the deeds, to the Sterling Estate, and all surrounding lands solely and exclusively to my daughter, Beatrice Alden. The Sterling family shall have no claim, no right of management, and no residence upon these lands save by her express permission. The silence that followed the reading was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom falling. But she is my wife, Arthur suddenly yelled, lunging forward, a step his eyes wide with a frantic, animal terror. The law of coverture applies. Even if that will is real, what belongs to the wife belongs to the husband. I am the Duke of Sterling, and I control her property. Beatrice looked at Arthur. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was the smile of a grandmaster watching her opponent realize he had moved his king directly into checkmate. Mr. Vance, Beatrice said softly, please clarify the Duke's current legal standing for the room. Mr. Vance reached into his briefcase and withdrew a second document. It was 3 pages of heavy paper tied with a black silk ribbon.
You dare betray
The annulment
me.
petition.
After
At the
all
bottom
I've
of the
done
third
for
page
this
was Arthur's
family,
sprawling, arrogant signature
I
sealed
won't
with his
build
crest.
This
This morning,
empire. You will take
Mr. Vance
it.
said, holding the
This
document
ends
up for the
now.
crowd to see,
You
His
will
Grace the Duke of
pay.
Sterling signed a petition for the
This
declaration of
document
nullity of
changes
marriage.
everything. You have
This
no
document
claim.
was filed and approved by the courts
A
at 3 o'clock
forgery
today.
means
Mr.
nothing
Vance
to
lowered
me.
the paper, his eyes fixing on
The
Arthur with a
court will
cold
see
professional
it
pity.
differently.
An annulment is not a standard divorce,
Thank
Your
you,
Grace,
unpredictable.
Mr. Vance explained. An annulment declares that the marriage was invalid from its very inception. Legally speaking, you were never married to Miss Alden, and because a legal marriage never existed, the law of coverture cannot apply. You have severed any and all retroactive claims to her inheritance. You signed away your only defense.
You think you can
Arthur
just
stopped
take
breathing.
what's
His eyes
mine?
darted from the black ribbon on the annulment
I don't
papers
need to
the
take
cold,
what was
merciless blue
always
eyes of the
mine.
woman he had ignored for 5 years.
This isn't
The
over.
trap had not just been sprung,
No.
it had been designed with such flawless mathematical cruelty that Arthur had enthusiastically locked himself inside it. He had signed the paper to get rid of a penniless burden. He had actually signed away the only legal tether keeping him from absolute bankruptcy. You... Arthur choked out the word, tearing at his throat. He looked at Beatrice, his aristocratic face crumbling into an expression of utter ruin. You planned this. You handed me that paper knowing I would sign it. I handed you a mirror. Arthur. Beatrice replied, her voice echoing in the vast silent hall. I simply allowed you to look at your own arrogance. You were so eager to throw me into the gutter that you did not realize you were standing on the edge of a cliff. Lies? Clara shrieked again. She lunged forward, her hands raised like claws, her face twisted into a demonic mask of fury. I am the Dowager Duchess of Stirling. This is my house. You will not take my house. The two constables stepped forward, instantly blocking Clara's path. One of them rested a heavy hand on his truncheon, fixing the Dowager with a hard, unforgiving glare.
Dare you
Clara stopped
betrayers?
chest heaving, spittle flying from her lips, as she screamed at the crowd. Do not listen to her, arrest her! The crowd was no longer looking at Clara with respect. They were looking at her with profound, horrified disgust. In high society, debt was a sin, but forgery and theft were unforgivable crimes. The aristocrats who had been sipping her champagne and laughing at her jokes only 10 minutes ago were now actively backing away. The Countess of Harrington turned her back entirely. The Earl of Merryweather was already
These documents
ushering his
confirm the
daughter toward the coat room.
irregularities.
Clara
What is the
Sterling
meaning
had
of
been exposed
this?
not just as a tyrant, but as a
Proof
criminal
of the
who had
board's
stolen an
deception.
orphaned girl's inheritance.
This is outrageous.
Her social power vanished in the
Review
span of
them
a single
carefully.
heartbeat, evaporating into the cold air. Beatrice stepped around the constables. She walked slowly toward Clara. Clara shrank back, her previous bravado shattering as the imposing, statuesque figure in midnight blue bore down on her. Beatrice stopped exactly 2 feet away from her former mother-in-law. 5 years ago. Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register that only Clara, Arthur, and the constables could hear clearly. You came into my father's bedroom while his body was still warm. You took my home. You took my name, and you took something else. Beatrice reached into the pocket of her riding habit. She withdrew the small velvet-covered ring box. She opened it. It was empty. She held the empty box out in her left hand while her icy blue eyes dropped to Clara's right, trembling hand. The massive Olden emerald caught the light of the chandeliers, mocking them both. Take it off, Beatrice commanded. Clara clutched her right hand to her chest, shaking her head frantically. No, Arthur gave it to me. It is the sterling emerald. Take it off. Beatrice repeated, her voice turning to pure steel. She raised the silver-tipped riding crop in her right hand, pointing it directly at Clara's chest. Or I will have the constables remove it for you, and I assure you they will not be gentle with your joints. Clara looked wildly at Arthur for help, but Arthur was gone. Not physically, he was still standing near the pillar, but his spirit had been completely broken. He was staring at the floor, his hands shaking, his mind unable to process the total annihilation of his life. He did not move to help his mother. He did what he had always done. He cowered in the shadows. Tears of pure, impotent rage spilled down Clara's powdered cheeks, ruining her makeup, leaving ugly streaked tracks of grey. With trembling, agonizing slowness, she pulled the heavy gold band from her finger. She dropped the ring into the empty velvet box in Beatrice's hand. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. Beatrice snapped the box shut. The sound was sharp and final, like the closing of a coffin lid. She slipped the box back into her pocket, reclaiming the last stolen piece of her soul. She turned away from Clara, dismissing the older woman from her attention completely, and looked at the crowd of aristocrats still lingering in the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, Beatrice called out, her voice ringing clear and authoritative.
After your betrayal,
I apologize for the
was
disruption
wrong.
of your evening,
I'll do
but
anything.
as the rightful and
too
sole
late.
owner of the Olden Estate, I'm afraid this gala is officially
Get
concluded.
out of my way.
You may retrieve your coats from the hall.
No,
My staff will
I
see you
have
safely
get
to your
through.
carriages. The guests did not need to be told twice. A mass hurried exodus began. There was no more music, no more laughter, only the frantic rustling of silk and the sharp click of heels, as the elite of the county
The
fled the
estate
sinking
is
ship of the
gone.
Sterling family. As the ballroom rapidly emptied, Beatrice turned her gaze back to Arthur and Clara. They looked small now, pathetic. Stripped of their titles, their wealth, and their stolen home, they were nothing more than a frightened man and an old, bitter woman. Mr. Vance has the eviction papers, Beatrice said, her tone devoid of any emotion. You are trespassing on private property. Arthur fell to his knees. The movement was sudden, jarring, the final collapse of a man who had nothing left. He looked up at Beatrice, tears streaming down his face. Beatrice, please! Arthur begged, his voice cracking. Please, it is raining outside. We have nowhere to go. We have no money. You cannot just throw us into the street. Beatrice looked down at him. She looked at the man who had let her freeze in a dark room, who had let his mother mock her torn clothes, who had signed a paper to ruin her life just that morning. I am not throwing you into the street, Arthur, Beatrice said quietly, turning on her heel and walking toward the grand staircase. I am simply taking out the trash. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property. If you are still here, when the grandfather clock strikes midnight, the constables will drag you out. The grandfather clock in the main corridor chimed the 3/4 hour. 11:45. The Olden estate was purging itself. The frantic, uncoordinated sounds of the exodus echoed through the grand halls, a sharp contrast to the elegant waltzes that had filled the air only an hour before. In the grand foyer, under the unforgiving glare of the chandelier, the reality of the eviction was playing out with brutal efficiency. Lady Clara Sterling was on her knees. She was weeping hysterically, her heavy purple dress pulled around her on the marble floor. In her trembling hands, she clutched a silver candlestick she had tried to secret away in a leather traveling bag. One of the constables stood over her,
Look at you,
his expression entirely
broken and
devoid of
defeated.
sympathy. He reached down and firmly
You thought
pried
you
the
could
silver
take
from her
what is
fingers.
mine?
All items within the residence are the legal
This is
property
your
of Miss Alden,
consequence. Remember
Mr.
this
Vance said,
moment.
smoothly, standing a few feet away with his ledger open. You are permitted your personal garments, nothing more. If you attempt to steal from this estate again, Lady Clara, you will spend the night in the county jail, rather than the road. Clara let out a raw, broken sob, burying her face in her hands. The powdered, arrogant Dowager Duchess who had ruled the county with an iron fist, who had mocked a grieving 16-year-old girl, was gone. In her place was a ruined, terrified old woman who suddenly realized the world had stopped caring about her title. Arthur Sterling stood near the heavy oak doors watching his mother weep. He made no move to comfort her. He was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own collapse. His tailored evening coat embroidered with silver thread felt like a mockery against his skin. He had no carriage. Beatrice had ordered the stable master to lock the carriage house. He had no bank accounts. Beatrice's
Wait.
injunction had
Please
frozen them
don't
all.
walk away from
He
me.
had exactly 15 minutes
I
before he
beg
was
you,
forcibly
just
thrown
listen
out
to
into a
me.
freezing November storm.
Don't
He turned his
leave
head,
me
his
here
pale green
alone,
eyes darting
please.
frantically toward the grand staircase, praying to see Beatrice descend. He believed with a desperate delusion of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his life that he could still talk his way out of this, if he could just speak to her alone, if he could just apologize. But the staircase was empty. Time is up, Mr. Sterling, the taller constable announced. He intentionally dropped the title of Duke. Take your bags, out the door. Wait, Arthur gasped, holding up his hands. I need to speak to her. I need to speak to Beatrice. Miss Alden is not receiving visitors. Mr. Vance replied without looking up from his ledger. The constables did not wait for further argument. They stepped forward, grabbed Arthur by the arms, and hauled him toward the open double doors. Clara shrieked as the second constable hauled her up by her elbows, thrusting her small leather satchel into her hands.
see you
They were
there
shoved out into
in
the grand portico.
shadows.
The cold November wind hit them instantly,
Your
driving heavy
silence
sheets of
mocks
rain
me.
under the stone archway. Beyond the portico, the long gravel driveway stretched out into the absolute darkness of the night. There were no lanterns lit for them. There was no shelter. Beatrice. Arthur screamed, twisting around to face the massive stone facade of the mansion. He ignored his mother's wailing. He ignored the freezing rain soaking through his fine velvet coat, plastering his light brown hair to his forehead. He stared up at the second floor, his eyes scanning the dark windows. Beatrice, please! Above him, the heavy glass doors of the master balcony slowly pushed open. Beatrice stepped out into the night. She stood at the edge of the carved stone balustrade, looking down at the driveway. She was still wearing the sharp, midnight blue riding habit, the high white collar gleaming faintly in the ambient light from the lower floor. The rain did not seem to touch her. The wind whipped her tightly braided platinum hair, but her posture remained absolute and unbreakable line of pure steel. Arthur broke away from the portico, running out into the pouring rain, the gravel crunching violently beneath his expensive leather shoes. He stopped directly beneath the balcony, looking up at her, like a starving man looking at a locked banquet hall. Beatrice, Arthur cried out, his voice cracking, tearing from his throat. I am sorry. Do you hear me? I am so incredibly sorry I was a coward. I let her treat you terribly, and I was too weak to stop her. But I see it now, I see everything. Beatrice looked down at him. Her icy blue eyes were completely unreadable. She rested her hands on the cold
No.
stone of the balustrade,
This
waiting
can't
for him to
be.
finish.
But
We can
it
fix
is.
this, Arthur pleaded, holding his
time
hands
is
up to
over.
her, the rain running down his
Please,
face like a
I
torrent of
beg
tears. The annulment was a mistake. We can tear it
Begging
up.
changes
We can go to the
nothing.
courts tomorrow and say it was a misunderstanding. You are my wife. I swear to you, if you let us stay, I will send my mother away. I will do whatever you ask. Or, just please, Beatrice, do not leave me out here in the dark. For a long moment, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the gravel. Then Beatrice spoke. Her voice was not loud. She did not need to shout over the storm. Her words cut through the wind with the terrifying, effortless precision of a falling blade. You misunderstand your position, Arthur, she said coldly. You are begging a woman who no longer exists. The fragile, frightened girl you ignored for 5 years died in the East Wing. You killed her through your cowardice. You buried her under your mother's cruelty. And you signed her gravestone this morning. Arthur sobbed, falling to his knees in the wet gravel. The mud splashed up, ruining his trousers, staining his hands. Please, I loved you. I did love you in the beginning. You loved the convenience of me. Beatrice corrected her voice, entirely devoid of pity. Or, you loved that I was a shield between your family and the debtor's prison. You did not ignore me to protect me. You ignored me because looking at me reminded you of exactly what you are, a thief living in a stolen house. Beatrice, have mercy, Lady Clara wailed from the shadows of the portico, shivering violently in her damp purple dress.
Of your new life
We will freeze to death. Beatrice shifted her gaze to the Dowager Duchess. The corner of her mouth twitched into a chilling, humorless smile. I'm showing you exactly the amount of mercy you showed a 16-year-old orphan when her father's body was still warm in the next room, Beatrice said. She reached into the pocket of her riding habit. She withdrew the heavy gold ring, the massive Alden emerald glinting violently as the lightning flashed across the sky. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, Beatrice slid the ring onto the third finger of her right hand. It fit perfectly. It had always belonged there. The grandfather clock is striking midnight, Arthur, Beatrice said, looking back down at the man kneeling in the mud. Get off my land. She did not wait for his reply. She turned her back on them, stepping away from the balustrade. She walked back into the warmth of her house, pulling the heavy glass doors shut behind her. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, cutting off the light, leaving Arthur and Clara in total unforgiving darkness. Down in the driveway, the two constables stepped out into the rain. They hauled Arthur to his feet, dragging him by his muddy velvet collar. Walk, the constable ordered gruffly. And so, the Duke of Stirling and the Dowager Duchess began the long, humiliating march down the mile-long gravel driveway. They walked through the freezing rain carrying their meager bags, their expensive shoes slipping in the mud. They walked past the manicured lawn they used to claim. They walked past the stables they used to command. When they finally reached the boundary of the estate, the heavy, wrought iron gates were already swinging shut. The iron hinges shrieked in the wet night, a sound like a final devastating judgment. The gates slammed together with a loud metallic clang that echoed through the trees. The lock was turned. The chain was secured. Arthur stood on the muddy public road looking through the iron bars at the sprawling, magnificent estate that was no longer his. He pressed his forehead against the cold iron, the rain washing away the last remnants of his dignity, and wept into the endless silent dark. Inside the mansion, the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Beatrice Alden stood in the center of the grand, opulent master suite, the room she had been barred from for 5 years. The fire in the grand marble hearth was roaring, casting a warm golden glow over the rich mahogany furniture and the heavy silk tapestries. The mended grey dress was gone forever. The empty velvet ring box had been thrown into the flames. Beatrice raised her right hand, watching the firelight dance inside the deep green depths of the Alden emerald. She felt the heavy, undeniable weight of it on her finger. She felt the quiet, absolute warmth of the house wrapping around her, finally recognizing its true mistress. She did not cry. She had given up weeping years ago. Instead, she took a deep, steady breath of the lavender-scented air, her spine perfectly straight, her icy blue eyes reflecting the flames. The ghost was gone. The Queen had returned. And the room that had once laughed at her would remain silent for the rest of her reign.